So good morning class or good day to everyone. So welcome to our DRR class, and I am Ms. Velasquez, your subject teacher. So for the lesson 1, we're going to have or talk about the basic concept of disaster and disaster risk. So as you can see in our map, okay, so you can see different kinds or different countries, no? So you will also see different colors, okay, that indicates like a dark green minimal risk, the yellow is the moderate risk, the lower risk is the light green, and high risk is the orange. Okay, so can you give me an example of country that is under moderate risk? Okay, so that is Russia. One of this is the Russia. We have also some Mongolia. Okay, and also for the high risk. Okay, so we have other countries for the high risk like okay, so we have Argentina, and also some small countries known for the high risk. And for the low risk, so we have small areas also or countries, and like with the minimal risk we have Canada, USA, Greenland. Okay, and so as you can see here in 2019 American risk map, okay, so the minimal risk here are the Canada, USA, and Greenland. For the low risk, it's small area like the Mexico, and the moderate risk we have Brazil. Okay, for orange is the high risk, and we are seldom have extreme risk here. Okay, for the Australia, so we have also minimal risk, and the low risk is we don't have we can see low risk here. Then there is only Papua New Guinea that is under high risk. For here, the European risk map, okay, so you can see most of the countries are under minimal risk, and then the low risk we have Belarus, Romania, and for the high risk we have Ukraine, Moldova, and the yellow one we have a small few countries that is under moderate risk, and for the extreme risk we don't have. And for the Asian map, so as you can see we have here the red one, the extreme risk, which is the and we have the Syria. Okay, so high risk is orange, Pakistan, and yellow is moderate risk, the Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan. Low risk, okay, so some of the countries like Myanmar, India, and the minimal risk is China. And for the African risk map, so mostly they are under high risk. Okay, we have a low risk, minimal risk, which is Zambia, Botswana, that is low risk. So there are also red, Libya, and extreme risk. So what does this risk map represent? So this risk map, okay, just showing us the countries that is under the different kinds of disaster risk. So as you can see, mostly the countries that under high risk is in an African country. Okay, and some are more on minimal risk. We have different countries that under a few extreme risks only. Okay, now let's go on to our country, which is the Philippines. So Philippines, a country prone to a natural disaster. So we all know that the Philippines is prone to a natural disaster. So the Philippines has an experience from an inexhaustible number of deadly earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and other natural disasters. So the Philippines, by virtue of its location, climate and topography, is one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world. This is according to Alampai 2014. So the Philippines is also a part of Circum-Pacific seismic belt and is positioned in between two major tectonic plates, which are the Eurasian and Pacific plates. So these are responsible for the creation of some mountain ranges, islands, volcanoes, earthquakes, and tsunamis. So as you can see, the geographical, the climate, and the location. So those are the factors that the Philippines have, so that it became prone to natural disaster. Okay. So again, reasons why Philippines is prone to disaster is because it is located across the Pacific Ring of Fire. So as you can see here, and so okay, aside from the Philippines, we have also Japan, and so some parts of Asia. Okay, and so that is the Pacific Ring of Fire. Okay, which is also located, no. Okay, so also we have Mount Mayon, okay, which is also an active volcano. Okay, and it is they said that we have Mount Mayon as an active volcano, or we have several volcanoes, because the Philippines is located under the Pacific Ring of Fire. Okay, so also Philippines and located in the Pacific Typhoon Belt. So we continuously experience different or various typhoons in the country in 1 year, or different years, no? So maybe we can experience 12 or more typhoons. So yeah, so we have recorded 20 cyclones, in our Philippines, and the most recently disastrous typhoon are Yolanda, Ondoy, Santi, Rolly, and Pablo. So which gave impacts, or great impacts, or disasters effect po. Okay. And so again, by virtue of its geographical location and features, the Philippines is exposed to a high potential for natural disaster and anthropologic hazards. In fact, the Philippines is one of the most hazard-prone countries in the world. And over the years, the country has suffered from an exhaustively number of deadly typhoons, earthquakes, volcano eruptions, and other natural disasters. Okay? So this is due to its location along the Ring of Fire or Typhoon Belt, a large Pacific Ocean region where many of Earth's volcanic eruptions and earthquakes occur. So for the past years, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, typhoons, and floods have been the most dominant problem of the country. Landslide and seismic waves often follow major tectonic events. So according to NDRRMP, among the natural disasters that affect the country almost annually, it was reported that the floods and the storms are the most frequently occurring. And in fact, according to Tuzaleta, Nantes 2000, and other researchers, floods are considered by many to be the natural phenomenon that affect more people and cause more damage to property than any other. Now, so kindly answer this in your notebook. So for question 1, why the Philippines is prone to a disaster? Okay, so you have 30 seconds to answer this one. Okay, time's up. And so I will going to read your answer po, okay, once you submit that. Okay, next. So again, unfortunately, the location and changing climate patterns also have made it difficult to make a long-lasting disaster risk reduction and management patterns. So example, the Super Typhoon Ulysses, okay, which is under the Vamco, okay, disaster risk reduction management pattern. We have also Super Typhoon Yolanda, which is under Haiyan, DRRM patterns, and Typhoon Undol, Ketsana. Okay, so I have here an icebreaker question. So in your opinion, are disasters natural? Why or why not? Explain your answer. Okay, so thank you so much for that answer. So again, our definition for a disaster is: a disaster is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society involving widespread human, economic, or environmental losses and impacts that exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resource. So, in a short, okay, disaster is a sudden, calamitous occurrence that causes great harm, injury, destruction, and devastation to life and property. We cannot tell if that incident is a disaster if it will have a great harm, injury, destruction, and devastation to life and property. Like for example, here in our pictures, you can see the COVID-19, okay, which even we didn't experience physical, okay, destructions like a human physical or buildings destruction, okay, so we still felt the great harm of it to everyone, okay, so the family, the loss of lives, and also the health and the economic, okay, also burdened with this disaster, okay. Again, okay, under United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, okay, this is the meaning or definition of disaster. Okay, a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. Okay, so in also in short, okay, even the community or society cannot cope easily po, okay, once this disaster, okay, come to them. Okay, so these are the examples of disaster. Okay, so after the typhoon, okay, some diseases like the COVID, okay, the virus, so that is considered a disaster. So now, okay, what are the basic concepts: disaster risk reduction, and disaster management? So again, a disaster is an event, either man-made or more often natural, that causes the disruption of community or society in which there is a large amount of human, economic, and environmental losses which exceed the capability of a community or society to handle with its own present resources in the occurrence of the event. So disaster will only be considered an event if there is a threat of loss of lives and or material. So we have your formula for a disaster. So vulnerability added to hazard divided to the capacity, okay, that will become the disaster. So here, you can see in our graph or illustration, we have here the hazard, vulnerability. So are the people coping, okay, with these hazards or vulnerability? If yes, okay, that is not a disaster. Okay, if no, if people can't cope, okay, to these events, to these hazards or vulnerability, so that will become a disaster. And that disaster, okay, can be prevented or minimized po, okay, the casualty also, okay, so by risk reduction and risk management. So let us remember, okay, to provide a clearer understanding, several points were given emphasis. So first, a serious disruption would signify that one can therefore expect a disaster event to be something which significantly changes the normal, okay, like the COVID, which the education becomes a new normal, you know. So it is an event which the majority of the affected community will perceive as removing them from the normal. So that is the meaning of serious disruption. And second, and the most important, is the distinction which the definition places on abnormal events and an event which we can classify as being a disaster. Okay? So these are the things that you have to remember about disaster. Now, I have the second question, and kindly answer this in your note. What do you mean by disaster? I will going to give you 30 seconds to answer this. Okay, time is up. Let's talk about the type of disaster. So we already know the meaning or concept, okay, of the disaster. First one, we have a natural disaster. So natural phenomenon that is caused by natural forces. So here are the examples of natural disaster. So we have a storm surge, earthquake, flood, thunderstorm, lightning, landslide, tropical storm, diseases, wildfires, and water shortages. These are the examples of natural disaster. We have also disaster. So this disaster caused by a man are those in which major direct causes are identifiable, intentional or non-intentional human actions. So we have different categories under man-made. First one is the technological industrial disasters. So example are the leaks of hazardous materials, accidental explosions, bridge or road collapses, or vehicle collisions and power cuts. Okay. These are the examples of technological disaster. Next one is the terrorism or the violence disaster. So these are the examples: bombs or explosions, release of chemical materials, release of biological agents, release of radioactive agents, multiple or massive shootings, and mutinies. That is under terrorism or violence. The third one is complex humanitarian emergencies. So the term complex emergency is usually used to describe the humanitarian emergency resulting from international or civil war. These are the example of complex emergencies. So involving a breakdown of authority, looting, and attacks on strategic installation, including the conflict situations and wars. Okay. And the last is the fourth, pandemic emergencies. So involving a sudden onset of contagious diseases that affects the health, disrupts services and businesses, and brings economic and social cost. So those are the types or classifications of disaster. Now, I want you to get again your notebook and answer this question. So what are the classifications or types of disaster? You have 30 seconds to write all the types of disaster, the categories. Okay, time's up. And next one is again, disasters have a major and long-lasting impact on people long after the immediate effect has been mitigated. That is why understanding the risks and the accompanying challenges is a very important component in disaster preparedness. So what by risk under United International Strategy for Disaster Reduction? So risk is defined as the combination of the probability of an event and its negative consequences. And how about disaster risk? So the term disaster risk refers to the potential, not actual and realized, disaster losses in lives, health status, livelihoods, assets, and services which could occur in a community or society over some specified future time period. So product of the possible damage caused by a hazard due to vulnerability within a community. So that is the meaning of disaster risk. So what are the elements of disaster risk? So we have here the hazard, vulnerability, and the exposure. Again, a disaster risk, you can determine it by checking the three aspects. We have the hazard, vulnerability to hazard, and coping capacity. So once we said hazard, it is defined as a dangerous phenomenon, substance, human activity, or condition that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, loss of livelihoods and services, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage, while vulnerability is the characteristic and circumstances of a community, system, or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effect of a hazard. So more on, we will going to discuss further the hazard and vulnerability to our next discussions. Okay. Now, I want you to this fourth question. What is a disaster risk? You have 30 seconds to answer this. Okay, time's up. And time's up. And now you know already the disaster risk. Next, So as the last component, so coping capacity for disaster risk reduction refers to the ability of people, organization, and system using available skills and resources to face and manage adverse conditions such as hazards, emergencies, or disaster. Therefore, a disaster risk is the product of the possible damage caused by a hazard due to the vulnerability within a community. So if that's your answer, you're correct. Okay? Now, okay, go on with your notebook and answer this question. So what are the elements again of disaster risk? You have 30 seconds to answer. 10 seconds. Time's up. Time's up. Now let's move on to our next topic, which is disaster risk reduction. So our subject, okay, it's entitled Disaster Readiness and Risk Reduction. Now, what is the meaning of disaster risk reduction? So as described by United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, it aims to reduce the damage caused by natural hazards like the earthquakes, droughts, and cyclones through an ethic of prevention. So with all this definition, disaster risk reduction is seen as the concept and practice of reducing risk through systematic efforts to analyze and manage the causal factors of this disaster. So meaning, in short, the DRR, okay, DRR's goal, okay, is to prevent, okay, this disaster effect po, okay, of our different kinds of disaster through systematic efforts, okay, in analyzing and managing the factors or the causal factors of this disaster. So how about disaster management? So disaster management can be defined as the organization and management of resources and responsibilities in dealing with all humanitarian aspects of emergencies, particularly preparedness, response, and recovery, in order to lessen the impact of disasters. So disaster management also aims to reduce or avoid potential losses from hazard, for prompt and appropriate assistance to victims of disaster, and achieve rapid and effective recovery. So we have 4 disaster management phases. First one is mitigation. So what is the meaning of mitigation? So it is about minimizing the effects of disaster. Like for example, building codes and zoning, vulnerability analysis, and public education. So that is the meaning of mitigation, minimizing the effects of disaster. And once we said preparedness, it is just planning how to respond. So example, the preparedness plans, emergency exercises or trainings, and warning system. Okay, so that is preparedness. Okay, for the third one, we have also response. So once we said response, it is the efforts to minimize the hazards created by a disaster, such as example, search and rescue and emergency relief. And for the last one, we have recovery, returning the community to normal, examples, the temporary housing, grants, medical care, for example, the war field. Okay, so the 4. Okay, now let's have the goal of disaster management. Okay, so these are the goals of disaster management. First is to reduce or avoid losses from hazards. Next is assure prompt assistance to victims. Third one is achieve rapid and effective recovery. Okay, So those are the 3 goals of disaster management. Now, again, disaster risk factors are variables that either aggravate or mitigate the effects of hazards affecting the degree or scope of a disaster. So number 1 is a physical factor. So these are the types of disaster risk. So first one is the physical factor. It is pertaining to tangible objects or infrastructure like the availability of fire exit, or the sturdiness of the building, or the presence or absence of the objects that can harm you or help you, etc. While once you said psychological factors, it includes the state of mental capacity and health. Like for example, are we dealing with babies, kids, adults, people with special needs? Perception of self, self-assessment of capability to respond to disaster or fear, and etc. So that is the first 2 disaster risk factor, okay, the physical factor and psychological factor. Next is the socio-cultural factor, which includes the religion, social status, traditions, perception by the society. And fourth is the economic factors, which includes the assets and liabilities, income, economic class, and etc. For fifth is the political factors. It includes the government, the structure, and democratic issues. And the sixth one is the biological factors, include the flora and fauna in the environment, health, diseases, and etc. So those are the factors, okay, or the disaster risk factors. Now, I want you to get again your notebook and answer this question. Okay, why learning disaster readiness and risk reduction is important? Okay, you have 30 seconds to answer this. Okay, time's up. Next one is question 7. We are still amidst a pandemic and we can consider it as a disaster. As a student, what are you going to do to help your family be safe from this and help the government to overcome it? Again, we are still amidst a pandemic and we can consider it a disaster. As a student, what are you going to do to help your family be safe from this and help the government to overcome it? So you have 30 seconds to answer this. Okay, time's up. So I hope you're done with answering the 7 questions, okay, throughout this discussion. Okay, so again, a disaster are emergencies that cannot be handled by those affected without outside assistance. So they are caused by natural or man-made events wherein communities experience severe danger and incur loss of lives and properties, causing disruption to their social structure and to all of the some of the affected communities' essential functions. So hence, disasters also are inevitable. They are caused by unsustainable development that has not taken account of possible hazard impacts in that location. Now, as we proceed in our subject, we will learn the various impacts of different disasters. Okay? Yeah, so I hope you learned something from this video, and thank you for listening. Have a good day, everyone.